My Sunshine by Rob Smith. Okay, here's a note to the reader from the author. Hi, buddy, or miss. Look, I know you've been sitting through a lot here. This is why I'd like to offer you the option of choosing your own ending. It's not fair for you to have slogged all the way here just to arrive at some cop-out ending you don't like. So there are 3 endings. A is happy, B is not, and C is, well, C is C. Choose wisely. Ending A. Coughing. Pain. It turns out that Mae Jennings didn't fall into the gaping chasm of the needle after all. When the ambulance started skidding down the concrete towards the broken road edge, she managed to throw herself out of the driver's door at the last moment, the left cuff of her shirt snagged on a ragged piece of steel jutting out of the ambulance undercarriage. As the doomed machine rolled past, she pulled and ripped on her shirt until it came off altogether. The ambulance tumbled over the edge and into the void. Although scared shirtless, she was still alive and on solid ground. She blacked out. Sometime later, she came to, choked and coughed on dust, wiped her eyes free of blood and looked around, barely making out any features from the haze of the debris cloud. She felt and fumbled in a direction that she hoped was up and out, and her hand brushed against metal, cold and solid. She felt around and up and gasped with alarm. It was the needle itself. In this close proximity, she could see her own breath billowing around her. The metal was infused with the absolute zero cold of space. A feeling of predestiny, of purpose crept over her. She was here for a reason. She had survived the shockwave, the drive through darkness, and leapt clear of her plummeting vehicle. But it wasn't enough that she had just survived. God must have brought her to this evil silver spike for a reason. Something was about to happen. She had to climb the needle somehow to stop whatever was about to happen next. In the darkness of the wreckage cloud, she fumbled and tripped over detritus. A child's bicycle twisted out of shape, broken windows, bricks. As she attempted to gird its circumference, looking for clues, the steel face was sheer and featureless in every direction, and as the light of day faded, it became a dark and ominous barrier to her will. So she found a sheet of corrugated tin and decided to cover herself, sleep in the shadow of the needle that night, to return to her search the next morning. She was cold in the night, laying in mud with no jacket, no shirt, and the needle's pervasive chill. When the sun came up, it was dull and ruddy through clouds of particulate still hovering in the atmosphere. Charcoal-colored rain fell. Mae threw aside her sheet of tin shelter and resumed the walk around the base of the needle, looking for clues on how to climb the thing. After hours and hours, her spirits were flagging, and she was weak with hunger and thirst. She fell to her dirt-encrusted knees. "God!" she cried out, begging to the sky. "Show me what to do!" Rain began to fall on her upturned broken features, as if God was crying in sympathy with her. A monstrous event such as the fall of the needle would be expected to upset the atmosphere. On July 18th, local conditions in winter, including wind currents and precipitation levels, had radically tanked, and that hot, clear night gave way almost instantaneously to a rainy, unnatural storm with crackling lightning. This storm circulated for several days, its locus being the spire of the needle. Winds there reached gale force levels, and after hours of buffeting, something started to rattle and work loose. A tow cable had not been properly detached from one of the space tow vehicles, and it was still welded to the top of the spire. It was miles long, and pulled loose by the storm, the unsecured end of the tow cable dangled and danced, bopping off the side of the needle with great ringing concussions, until finally it flopped onto the ground in Winter, South Dakota, at the feet of Mae Jennings. "Thank you, God," she triumphed, and then reached for the long cable. It was thick, perhaps 6 inches in circumference, and it was cold. The pads of her fingers began to stick to the cold steel, and she pulled them away quickly with a stinging rip before she permanently stuck to it. This would be difficult, she reflected, but God wanted her to do it. She pulled a scarf off her neck and ripped it in half, double wrapping each length of cloth around her hands. Reinforced and protected from the cold, she grasped the cable firmly and began to climb. She hadn't climbed a rope since she was in high school, but while she was in high school, she was a state champion gymnast, and her muscles quickly remembered how to pull and lift, bracing her booted feet against the needle's flawless surface. She straightened her body into a plank position, stiffened her resolve, and climbed the dangling cable, hand over hand, again and again. The ground drifted away below as Mae Jennings ascended, not knowing how high she needed to go or what she was going to find. A clue from God was all she could hope for. She climbed and prayed and climbed. Her heart thundered in her chest and her arms felt like lead. After an hour of climbing without rest, she was probably half a mile up in the air. A fall from this height was definitely fatal. And still, she saw no sign of what she was to do. A cruel wind whipped her from left to right, and she lost her footing. She spun, panicked, dangling over emptiness like a yo-yo on a string. The ground spun dizzyingly a long, long way down. The wind went from howling in protest back to whimpering, and she was able to scrabble her feet against the side of the needle until her momentum had settled down and she could resume the braced climbing position. Rain began to fall again, hard this time, and her heart sank. The cable was going to become too slick to hold. The side of the needle would be coated with treacherous water. How could she continue to climb? For a wavering moment, Mae began to doubt God. How could He do this to her? How could God save her from the pit, only to let her fall to her death a second time? Rain fell in sheets now. Blinded and desperate, she tried to flex her fingers with all the strength she had, to pierce them into the steel if possible to give her a life-saving grip, but alas, Mae was only a woman with a woman's strength, and it began to sap. As expected, her hands started to slip, 1 inch, then 2 inches. At any moment she expected to slip off completely and start a long, terrifying plunge to a skull-dashing death on the rocks below. Is there a God? Who knows? When we die, it will all become apparent. Maybe. Hopefully. Maybe people will wake up in a garden that smells of roses and lavender, with heavenly sunlight suffusing their every thought and dream. Maybe when we die, we wake up to eternal darkness. Maybe there's someone there to keep us company, a celestial being. Maybe a demon. But the question remains a mystery until that moment the mortal coil is shuffled off. Who is waiting on the other end? For Mae, it was someone who knew how to make a wrong situation go right, because whoever is up there watching sent her a lifeline, literally. Up in space, Vasily Miskowski, Russian cosmonaut, was clinging outside of Smelter 1, performing routine maintenance with his high-intensity steel cutter arc welder. It was a spacewalk. He was high above the Earth in a spacesuit, tethered to a transport platform, when the intercom warning came in with a buzz. Time to move. Smelter 1 will go to position Charlie Delta. What, now? Vasily thought the move was tomorrow. He was not thrilled to be on the outside of the smelter while it moved in high orbit. Adrenaline making him clumsy, he hastily retethered his spacewalk line from the transport platform to the habitat pod. It hung up again and again, his clumsy spacesuit fingers ill-suited to use the carabiners. Jackson buzzed on his speaker and delivered another warning. Vasily, I don't know what the Russian word for Garrett is, but you and I are both going to be learning that real soon firsthand if you don't get in here right now. I left my spare suit on the transport platform. Leave it. Get it after we move the smelter. Miskowski re-entered the habitat for the smelter maintenance crew, and not a moment too soon. Lateral motion rockets fired, and the ship floated off its orbit. In space, there is no jarring sense of motion that one would expect. Dreamily, the ship realigned itself. Looking out the viewport, Miskowski spotted the platform he was working on as it drifted past his sight line. Dismayed, he banged his head off his helmet visor. It made a poing sound. Bozh moi! Jackson! I didn't secure the transport. It's falling back to Earth. Oh, Jackson said, speechless for a moment. Assumably, he was looking out his own view window to watch the platform and its accompanying cables tumbling away. How do you say screwed up big time in your language, Vasily? May Jennings couldn't hold on any longer. She slipped. Her hands held nothing, and she started to fall. A sudden impact from behind knocked the wind out of her. She spun and spun, the spiral motion dazzling her into unconsciousness. When she awoke sometime later, she was hanging by the waistband of her pants from a large metal grid, which was hanging suspended over the floor of the South Dakota desert, apparently dangling from some source high above. Her jeans were making ripping noises with every small motion, and as the grogginess left her mind, it was replaced with sharp panic, and she clung desperately to the metal grid, scrambling up its side until she found a level surface she could stretch out across. Safety is a relative term in a precarious place, but it was better than no safety at all, and she allowed herself to relax, to allow her muscles to uncramp, for blood to flow again. She appeared to be stranded on some sort of motorized platform which fell from the sky. It had markings of the Russian space program. She spotted a footlocker and opened it to find water and food packets. She wolfed down the contents of the food bags, surprised at her own hunger. Chewing, she noticed a red spacesuit tucked into the box and a large, intimidating tool. The side of the tool was simply labeled Steel Cutter. Looking up at the sky, she spotted the point where the cable terminated, high up at the apex of the needle. Studying the platform a little more closely, she was intrigued by what appeared to be a heavy motor and a pair of green and red buttons. Would this platform move? Would it climb the cable? Was this the solution sent to her from heaven? Feeling wild, reckless, and empowered by God, she pressed the green button, and the machine surged to life, climbing the cable skyward at a rapid pace. The ascent, now mechanically aided, turned a day-long trip into hours. It whined and grinded its way up the cable, juddering occasionally, nerve-janglingly. Clear of the detritus cloud, Meg could see in miles in all directions, and after an hour of ear-popping skywards motion, she decided to put on the spacesuit, knowing the air would soon get thin beyond tolerance. Temperatures dropped to shocking cold as she zipped the final zipper and sealed the suit's seals. She could only estimate the height she reached by her prior experience with being on airplanes, and her dizzying elevation looked similar to that of an airplane flight. How was she going to get back down, she wondered. But soon those thoughts left her mind as she was boggled into awe by the sight that met her upon reaching the apex of the needle. Vast metal lines were stretching into the sky beyond her line of vision. They were gradually being pulled tight by some otherworldly source. This was what God had sent her to deal with, and looking at the footlocker again, she knew how to do it. She hauled out the steel cutter, which purred to life in her hands. Careful not to pierce her own spacesuit, she maneuvered herself close enough to the nearest mammoth metal cord and began to cut into it. International news items. Forever Sun plan foiled, Great Space Poll fails. SpaceX has not commented on the specific nature of the technical failure, but a crucial steel cable broke unexpectedly. A skeptical reader may ask how one plucky woman with a handheld steel cutter managed to sever the gargantuan cables tethering our planet to a collection of powerful off-world rockets. A skeptical reader might object to the idea that her cutter was sharp enough to do the job, or that a person as small as May Jennings would have the physical ability and height required to saw through a steel cable the size of a subway train. But skeptics aren't familiar with the bewildering and inspiring power of miracles. Take, for example, how in May's hands the steel cutter blazed with holy power, comparable to the flaming sword wielded by the cherubim in defense of the Garden of Eden. That is miraculous, and so was the strength May Jennings found to cut the steel lines in service of the Lord. Perhaps most miraculously of all would be the fact that after she had cleanly severed the threat to Earth, a mighty wind blew and lifted her safely off the side of the needle and carried her safely back to her home hospital site in Fort Pierre, several miles away. Yes, scoff, skeptic, scoff. But that's what happened. Sometimes you just have to take things on faith. International news item. President arrested. The Golden Gulf man himself has been pulled down from office in a non-violent coup as cohorts of his higher military officers uniformly turned against him. An arrest was performed, and a visibly relieved Vice President Paul Smith declared that the madness of the previous regime had finally come to an end. From the South Dakota Cornet, school board member makes Hall of Fame. Fort Pierre resident and school board member May Jennings recounts the struggles she faced while scaling the side of the vile South Dakota Needle. Jennings is the first woman to climb hand over hand to reach an elevation of 10,000 feet and was presented with an award from the Guinness Book of World Record Committee. Smiling broadly, Jennings credits her 2 children and God for giving her the strength to persevere.